Lyft just announced a new pay standard for drivers, and I gotta say, this is ridiculous. The new pay standard, and that is that you get 70% of rider fares each week after external fees. This is, massive. I want to say too, as a side note, I lost my voice. I'm currently recovering from Mardi Gras, just got back, and actually saw this when, I was bouncing around Mardi Gras and everything, and I'm like, oh my God, this is game-changing. They're right here. After external fees are subtracted from rider payments, your share is 70% or more each week, guaranteed. This is pretty big, right? That obviously you see some things down here like transparent earnings, track it all in the app, et cetera, et cetera. But this is big because I've talked before that there needs to be a minimum hourly guarantee for rideshare drivers. I've talked about this in a bunch of other videos. And I talked about different solutions. Like, is a solution maybe, having there be a law put in place or something like that? I don't know. This to me seems at least a kind of cool halfway point, that it's not a full-on minimum hourly guarantee the way it typically is for, let's say, a place like New York or California. But this is pretty massive, right? Obviously, we have some drivers stuff down here. You can see right here, you can earn more when you do scheduled rides. They now put something in place called Elite, which I'm going to talk about in a different video. Queued ride and ride switches, airport rides. So there's a lot of stuff that Lyft is doing that they're really trying to make it better for drivers. And whether you love Lyft or hate it, and when it comes to David Reisher, I know it's a mixed bag for people the way they view him. But I got to say, I think this is huge, right? Going to here now, this is the earnings commitment. This is kind of like the little bit of a nitty gritty, but you can see Lyft's earnings commitment guarantees that a driver's weekly earnings will be at least 70% of passenger payments after external fees. If the driver's earnings are below that 70% when the weekends, they'll get paid an earnings adjustment to make up the difference, right? The earnings commitment is available in most major cities with plans to expand soon. So I will say, unfortunately, this isn't 100% everywhere, but this is massive, right? I will say this as well. You can also track all the nitty-gritty details in the app, that the tracker will display passenger payments after external fees, your earnings, and the estimated Lyft fee. And then going down here, you can see this kind of like the different things in terms of like the specifics, right? The drivers will earn 70% or more of passenger payments after external fees are deducted, like I've said. This is the minimum that drivers should expect to earn. So let's say if you drive and whatever the passengers are paying, surging or not surging, if there's extra things the passengers are paying, you're going to get 70% or more of that. That's pretty big, right? Because you have passenger payments here, right? They of course go to you, all the drivers. They have both Lyft fees. They cover external fees, commercial insurance and taxes, all these kind of nitty gritty stuff. Like, of course, Lyft needs to take some of that money to continue operating as an app and all this kind of stuff. And I got to say, this is massive to me because I think one big issue I've seen a lot, and this actually happened in New Orleans, right? I'm going to be doing a video about what it's like to drive for Lyft and Uber in New Orleans because I actually interviewed a lot of drivers. It's interesting that a lot of drivers have this complaint, but they're like, okay, a passenger gets a Lyft and Uber, and they start talking to the passenger. They're like, hey, if you don't let me ask them, like, how much did you pay for this Lyft? And the passenger says, oh man, paid $40. It's surging. And then the driver says, $40? On the app, I'm only getting $14. Where's that extra money going? And this is a big thing that I know is kind of this tricky gray area that you don't really talk about when it comes to Uber and Lyft. And the reason why is you get kind of odd. As a passenger, you're like, well, I don't want to say how much money I'm spending. And also, too, a lot of passengers probably don't realize that the driver, you don't really see how much a person's spending. You're seeing how much you're getting. And that's a huge, huge difference, right? So it's kind of this like elephant in the room in the sense, more so for drivers than passengers, where drivers are like, all right, I accepted this ride. It's $12, but how much are they paying? You're not mad at the passenger for how much they're paying. That's out of their control. But you're also curious, like, regardless of what they're paying, when you cut up the difference, what's going to Uber and Lyft? Like I said with that example, let's say a passenger gets an airport ride, it costs them $40. The driver only gets $14. What's that extra $26 for the going? Shouldn't the driver get more? And I think this is a massive game changer so that after everything, of course, after the fees, that's an inevitable part of being a driver for Uber and Lyft. that after the fees, you're going to get 70% of whatever the passengers are paying. So to make numbers super, 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 super simple, I'm aggressively simplifying this, like ignore things like fees and whatnot. I mean, if let's say you drive during the week and all the passengers combined pay $100, ignoring fees because that can get a little tricky because there's all these different percentages and whatnot. Let's say you make $60 off that. Lyft will say, you know what? You should get $70 because you should get 70% of that 100, 70. You only need 60. We'll give you that extra $10. This is a really, really cool and creative idea, and I really like this. I got to say that this is something that, you know, I've talked before in a bunch of other videos about different proposed solutions I have about how to make it better for drivers, right? Of course, I know every driver is going to say, well, Mark, you want to get paid more. Yes, but a lot easier said than done, right? How do you get paid more? Where does that money come from? You know, I proposed about different ideas of charging every passenger across the board an extra $2, and then the extra $2 for every ride allows people, allows Lyft and Uber drivers to have a minimum hourly guarantee. Should be something in place when it comes to that, right? It is tough to say exactly what it is. Another thing I will say is when it comes to the tipping option, maybe having Lyft and Uber be more aggressive, saying, hey, give your driver a tip, which they do. They do that now mid-ride and post-ride, but maybe say something like, hey, just a reminder, drivers get 100% of their tips. This does not go to Lyft. It does not go to Uber. 100% of the tips go to drivers. I proposed these solutions in the past in other videos, and this is one that is, honestly, I'm not going to lie, super creative. I think this is super creative, super unique, and I know there's probably going to be some people like saying, oh, Mark, well, this is BS or whatever. That always happens on some videos. I know some people like some things, some people don't. That's the nature of, I guess, humans. You know, we all have different opinions, as cliche or as maybe Captain Obvious as that is to say. But for me, this is one of the most creative solutions I've seen of how to pay drivers what they need to get paid while also making it not as much pressure on passengers, while also making it very transparent for drivers about the exact price breakdown. And lastly, this can only guarantee you having more money. If, let's say, and I'm making, again, numbers up, ignoring fees, just because that's where the math gets even more tricky, and obviously I want to make this very simple. Let's say passengers pay $100 in a week, you make $80 off that 100, well, you know what? You keep the 80, right? Because who cares? You made over that 70%. So it's only if you make less than that. I want to say it's not going to lose you money in a sense. So I do want to stress that, just in case you're looking at this being like, wait, so 70% is like the hard cutoff? No. They're only going to bump you up if you make less than that. So you can only make more money from this. If, let's say, you make $60 in a week and the passengers paid $100, love to say, oh, you know what? We got to guarantee him 10 extra bucks. Boom, that's 10 extra bucks to you. And like I said, this is not, of course, a minimum hourly guarantee. Far from that. But at least it's some type of guaranteed earning structure that makes a lot of logistical sense. This is actually, I'm not going to lie, I'm very impressed that when I first saw this, when I was at Mardi Gras, of course, taking Lyfts and Ubers, although I will say I did walk around a lot because I stayed in the French Quarter during Mardi Gras. But anyway, you know, when I remember looking at this, I was like, this is actually super clever of how to give drivers a guarantee that they know if they make a certain amount less than they expected, they get bumped up. You're getting money from Lyft. They're going to bump you back up. You're also not going to lose money. It's not like they say, hey, if you make 80%, we're going to have to take you back down to 70. Nope, they're saying, hey, if you make more than 70%, good for you. Good for you, right? And this is also not involving any new law or legislation or some type of rule like a Prop 22 thing in California. It's not involving these other things. I think this is a very smart way to move the needle in the right direction that I think, of course, at the end of the day, keeps drivers as independent contractors. This is like, and I know some drivers sometimes get mad about like what Lyft and Uber is doing, and I've of course talked about that in videos, about the pros and the cons of Lyft and Uber. I've gone to that in aggressive detail. But I think with this, it is kind of the most perfect blend. Like I've said this before, that it's tough. Back in the day, I wanted drivers to be employees. I've now changed my stance, and I think drivers should stay as independent contractors, but get employee-like benefits. I like to call it, as if you think about it, like when it comes to dating, you have like being single or in a relationship. Then you have this kind of a midway point where it's like friends with benefits. I feel like in a unique sense, this is almost like kind of falling into that category. I've mentioned this in other videos, where it's independent contractor with benefits, both, I guess, literally and figuratively, depending on how you look at that, where drivers are now getting, like say in places like California and New York, things like health insurance, things like a minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera. But it's tough because that does involve a lot of law and legislation, right? It involves court systems and lawyers and all this kind of stuff. But with this, it's a way to kind of not have to deal with all that red tape, all that kind of, let's call it low-key BS of all these different rules and laws and legislation. They just say, you know what? This is our new policy. This is what we're doing. And it's a way to kind of have employee-like benefits without being an employee, which is creating that middle ground. Like I've said in a bunch of other videos, Uber and Lyft is really the only independent contractor job that usually gets put in its own category. When AB5 passed here in California, or after AB5, ride sharing was the only one that said, okay, this is an asterisk on AB5 just for ride sharing, right? Because ride share drivers, most of them want to stay as independent contractors, but they want to get the benefits of being an employee. And it's like, well, it's a tough gray area. It's kind of tough to balance both at the same time. It's almost like I've said, ride share driving has this kind of own unique classification category. And this is just absolutely massive. I'm a huge fan of this, as you can tell from this video. I'm very, very excited about this because, like I've said, I think a lot of drivers forget that it isn't easy to operate Uber and Lyft at the intense level that they do. I know a lot of times drivers like to bash Lyft and Uber, and I have too. I've been very honest and even borderline, directly pessimistic, where I almost low-key attack Lyft and Uber saying, I don't like what you're doing. This is BS. And I'm very honest about that. And this is one of the, I think, most clever and unique ways moving forward that's been proposed by Uber or Lyft to make it better for drivers in terms of getting payment. Now, yes, do we have a long way to go? Yes, but I feel like that this is a really good first start. That this is now just a thing. It's not like they're saying, hey, for this weekend we're doing this. It's not like they're saying, I don't know. I think this is an incredibly clever, incredibly genius way to, I think, entice more drivers to go out, continue driving, and making the money that they deserve. And this way, now that you know that if you don't make the money that you deserve, this is coming out of Lyft's pocket to bump you back up to that 70% or whatever the passengers paid for when you drove. Gotta say, this is probably one of my favorite things I've seen so far in the ride-sharing industry in a long time.